Over the weekend, we saw the worst night of aerial bombardment of Ukraine since the start of the war. It was absolutely horrific for people across the country. And it led to President Trump going on a bit of a rant, really, calling Vladimir Putin absolutely crazy. So with diplomacy seemingly failing, we shouldn't just make that our focus, because there is still a war going on the ground. And we've got a great panel of experts to answer your questions today on this edition of Ukrainecast. We've got some great questions coming in from our listeners. Let's start with this one from Chris.
I would like to know from a military expert whether the Russian army is stronger or weaker than in 2022. On the one hand, it has lost a lot of men and material. On the other hand, it is battle-hardened and has experience of new technologies such as FPV drones. And it has an economy geared up to support a war.
Olga?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, and the tendency is absolutely as this gentleman described. Yes, Russia has lost one of its best, most prepared fighters in 2022, especially paratroopers, Marines, special forces. But since then, Russia managed to replenish most of its losses. Yes, it's not those highly trained professionals, but they are exactly battle hardened. We also see that now those veterans, some of them with severe wounds, others just moved from the front line to the studying facilities. So they're passing on this first-hand experience to the young cadets, to the military academy students. So yes, they are evolving, and production is working literally 24/7. Some military factories are working 3 shifts a day and night, and we see that the production of military drones has increased tremendously. They're using technologies from Iran, etc. So yes, they're definitely stronger than they used to be at the beginning of 2024, but with significant losses.
Mikey, we know the difference that drones have made in this conflict. I mean, how would you rate the Russian army right now?
I think one of the most important things that we've seen from this, having spent 20 years as the British military and in capability procurement inside the Ministry of Defence, I think that Putin's shown his cards. And what I mean by that is that he has shown the world that his capability across the land, air, and maritime spaces isn't as good as what we originally thought. Isn't as good. What does that mean? It means that not only is a lot of the capability that he is using old, he's also shown that the logistical resupply and maintenance of things like Sukhoi 27, MiG-29, main battle tanks, isn't what we thought it was. And the reason we know that is because if you rewind back to the early days of the invasion with the attempt to capture Kyiv, that was a massive failure. If you look at the attrition rates on a very conservative level, they've lost over 200,000 people. That's fatalities, known fatalities, and that's reported by the BBC. The number is going to be much higher than that. So on the personnel level, they've been attrited. They've been attrited on the maritime level through hits on shipping in the Baltic Sea. They've been massively hit on the land component level in terms of main battle tanks. And when it comes to air power, they've not managed to dominate or get any form of air superiority over the eastern side of Ukraine. Now, clearly, Ukraine have had support from Poland in terms of F-16s. They've had support from France in terms of Mirage 2000s. But the tactics, the training, the procedures, little things like having flares on the jets. What flares do is they create a heat source that decoys the surface-to-air missile. They're running out of those. So, with all those combinations and factors taken into account, with a military capability that was perceived to be massive pre-2022, they still haven't been able to make serious inroads outside of 4 main areas, 4 main oblasts inside Ukraine. So I don't see how they're stronger.
I would argue that they've learned from some key mistakes made in the past. They've learned not to underestimate the enemy in many ways. As Mike mentions, we hardly ever see those huge convoys that we saw outside Kyiv in 2022, where you take out the start and the end and it's stuck. They've learned to circumvent sanctions. They've learned to procure key components for their drones, for their missiles, despite these sanctions. And as Olga says, they've learned to replace a lot, if not all of the people they're losing. The quality of those new fighters may not be the same, but the quantity seems to be always there.
Battle hardened is one thing. Let's take the US military. Let's take the UK military. Battle hardened from tours in Iraq, 8 years. Battle hardened from over a decade in Afghanistan, both lost. So battle hardened's one thing. The strength of military might and the tactics, training, and procedures used on that military might is another. And I think they're clearly struggling because in 3 years, they've not made any serious inroads outside of Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson.
Let's bring in Colin, who is one of our regular listeners and joins us on the line. Hi, Colin.
Hi there.
You have a question for us?
Yes. So my question is regarding the referendums that Russia held in 2022 to incorporate those 4 Ukrainian oblasts into the Russian Federation. How can any Russian politician claim that these referendums were free and fair? I mean, if nothing else, there were huge proportions of the population who didn't vote or couldn't vote because they either weren't in the occupied areas or they had already fled. So I'm wondering, is this ever called into question in Russia?
Well, I guess to answer that, we need to go back more than 10 years to 2014, because current Russian ideology is built on referendums on the referendums in Crimea in 2014, which de facto was annexation of Crimea by Russia, and referendums in Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine. So Russia not only claims, it's enshrined in law. So if you question the legitimacy of those, you can go to jail. And if you agree those referendums were legit, and the picture was exactly the same. Significant amounts of population were not ready to vote. In Crimea in 2014 and in Donetsk and Lugansk, you had people with Kalashnikovs standing at the polling stations. I was there. I've seen that. They were saying we are guarding the station, but it is very humiliating if next to the ballot box you see 2 guys with Kalashnikovs.
That is, if you make it to the polling station, because in September 2022, when those, and I'm tempted to use, I have to use quote marks around the word referendums, when they took place in the 4 Ukrainian regions in the southeast, a lot of the time you'd have a Russian soldier with a Kalashnikov and somebody with a ballot box knocking at your door, and you've got to vote at gunpoint. Forget about the secrecy of voting. Forget about independent observers. So, in the words of a UN functionary at the time, she called it an exercise in giving what's going on a veneer of democracy. So there's that. But also, to answer your question, Colin, I don't think a lot depends on whether or not these quote-unquote referendums are recognized. If we look at examples of other countries losing territory or being split for whatever reason, take Georgia. After 2008, it lost 20% of its territory to forces backed by Russia and to Russian forces. Nobody's recognized that, apart from Russia, obviously, and a handful of other countries. And yet, Georgia's effectively lost 20% of its territory for now. Northern Cyprus, only Turkey recognized it, and yet the island remains divided. The US never recognized the annexation of the Baltic states, by the Soviet Union, and yet they were part of the Soviet Union for 50 years. So there's legal recognition and there's what's happening on the ground.
Is that one of your concerns, Colin, that this could just become frozen and not kind of internationally recognised, but not recognised either?
Exactly. So Vitaly gave some very good counterexamples there, but I am wondering, with the current talk about the conflict potentially freezing along current lines, but potentially de facto recognition of Russia's control over the currently occupied territory. And I'm just wondering if down the line, could we conceivably see a situation where other countries do begin to recognize those referendums from 2022?
Well, looking the other way would essentially amount to de facto recognition. And Donald Trump has repeatedly threatened to walk away from the whole Ukraine peace process or talks process. And that is exactly what Vladimir Putin wants. And that would amount to the US effectively saying, we're not interested anymore. Do whatever you like with those 5 regions.
Yeah, and you also see how it's eroding, because in 2014, the West was saying absolutely no chance we're going to recognize Crimea, the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk republics. Now it's sort of moved to this bargaining chip. They say, maybe not those 4 new territories, but okay, maybe Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk. So we see how it's moving. Putin is there. He doesn't need to exercise in democracy. He doesn't need to win elections, so he can wait for a very long time, unlike many of the Western politicians who have to care a lot about election cycles.
Colin, thank you for joining us with your question.
Thank you.
Time for another question, and it's back to what's happening on the battlefield, and particularly the production of drones. Here's Heidi.
Hi Ukrainecast, it's Heidi from Warwickshire. We hear about Ukrainian drone expertise, and I wonder if there's any plans to produce them in the UK or Europe. Surely this would be a cost-effective way to send more help and weapons. Thank you. Bye.
Oh, yes, it would be. Ukraine has pioneered the use of drones on a massive scale in lots of new innovative ways, and Western countries, as well as Russia, are learning from it. As it happens, the British Defence Ministry is publishing its long-awaited defence review next Monday, where it's going to say that they'll turn to AI as well as drones as a new battlefield strategy. So I would not be surprised if that strategy means producing more drones.
I think the really interesting thing about drones at the moment isn't necessarily the offensive strike capability of drones, but more the ability to defend from them. And this is a major problem. The Americans have what's called a counter laser weapon system, which has been trialed in the Middle East, which obviously uses a laser capability to try and deny the drone from hitting its target. There are other concepts such as using RF, which is called radio frequency, to take the drones out of the sky. But the big problem with counter-drone technology is that whatever is designed for the battlefield has to be very different from what has to be designed for domestic capability. And the simple reason for that is that if you shoot a drone down on a battlefield, your concerns are less with where that drone goes rather than taking out its ability to hit a target. There have been recent instances in Lakenhall and Mildenheath, which is in the east of England, about swarms of drones hitting, and they're 2 US bases, by the way, swarms of drones detected in the area of those 2 quite critical airfields, which have completely stalled the ability of those airfields to be able to operate. Likewise in Langley, over in the States. And the problem they've got using domestic defensive capability is that the main concern or risk element within that domestic bit is they're not prepared to use the battlefield technology in a domestic scenario because they place high risk on where that drone might fall. So it might fall on a domestic house, a car, it might kill someone. And so this is this whole drone piece, yes, Ukraine have got advanced technologies. Yes, Russia is outsourcing a lot of it to China. But the real interesting bit for me, and this is where the race is in the counterpiece.
Mikey, do you think we've moved on at all this week on the use of long-range missiles into Russia? You and I were both listening to Chancellor Merz and President Zelensky yesterday talking about this. What's the latest on the use of this Taurus missile system the Germans have?
Taurus is effectively a Storm Shadow missile, so it's launched from a jet, it's a bunker buster, it's got twice the range, so it takes it out of 500 kilometers. That's what Taurus gives Zelensky. Why is that important? Because the Taurus missile at 500 kilometers can start hitting command and control, it can start hitting logistics resupply. Pershing, the general from the US, once said that infantry wins battles, logistics wins wars. And by the Taurus missile, or a similar capability to the Taurus missile, what Zelensky can do is it can push those command and control centers, it can push those logistic resupply hubs further back into Russia, which makes it harder to resupply any Russian infantry that are trying to completely occupy the four regions or go even further inside Ukraine. So what Merz and Zelensky came out with from the press conference, Lucy, that we were on listening live on the channel, was sort of a hybrid solution to that, which is my takeaway from it is that Merz will give the IP, the intellectual property of what Taurus is about, allowing Zelensky to organically make something similar to Taurus, but it also allows Germany to step away politically and from an optics perspective to say that they haven't supplied them with Taurus, because the big question here and the big question on HIMARS and ATACMS, Ukraine has had ATACMS since 2020, probably late 2022. But what he wasn't allowed to do, because he didn't have the Biden administration's permission, was deep strike into Ukraine. They now have that.
Let's finish with this question that we've had in from Chris.
Hi team, my question is around the children that were kidnapped from Ukraine and taken into Russia at the start of the war. We don't seem to hear much about this, and it doesn't seem to form part of the negotiations or ceasefires that the US are talking about. I just wondered if you could update us on this, that'd be great. Thanks.
The Ukrainian government is saying that more than 19,000 Ukrainian children have been forcibly deported to Russia. The British government is saying more than 6,000 Ukrainian children have been relocated to what the Brits call a network of re-education camps in Russia. So thousands.
Also, what is interesting and what strikes me is that some of the kids who weren't kidnapped, but they were born in Donetsk and Lugansk, and they were growing up there during the referendums. Now, some of them have reached age of 18, so now they can act for themselves. And what we see is that many of them choose to go to Ukraine. So they act against the odds. They ask Ukrainian volunteers to fund them. They leave their families. They cover tremendous distances through Russia, through Belarus, to go to Ukraine, more in rare cases into Europe, and that's the future they choose. I think that's very interesting.
But Olga, how is this seen in Russia? How is this issue treated or discussed inside Russia?
They were covering it a lot in 2022, showing that they are saving them from how Putin says, Nazi regime, etc., saving them from the war. But now they went quite silent. But what is hard is that we see that many of those kids then reappear in so to say, orphanage databases, but they change their names completely. They change their surnames. So it's really hard to connect the dots. And independent volunteers, both Ukrainians and Russians, spend months of their time trying to connect those fake identities to real identities and help those kids. Many of them actually do have relatives in Ukraine. They're just a bit more distant than immediate mothers and fathers, to connect and to ask whether they want to come back.
To answer Chris's question about whether this is part of the talks, well, Zelensky's trying. he's asked on several occasions that all the children, Ukrainian children that ended up in Russia, be returned. It's another question whether the Russians are actually willing to talk about it, or even the Americans. I've not heard them to mention it either. But he's raised that possibility or request.
It also seems, just talking to independent volunteers, it seems many of those negotiations are going off the record, because when we as journalists request Russian officials on the record what's going on, they are exactly silent. But if you talk to their ADs, to some of their proxies off the record, suddenly things do move a bit. So it seems there is maybe two different currencies. So official version is always good, nothing is going on, but it seems sometimes those consciousness gets through propaganda, and on individual basis, case-to-case basis, some Russian officials or people close to Russian officials actually help to things happen.